All right, welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government, and my name is Ken Hicks, and we've been learning about these very important intermediary institutions. Of course, in the last presentations, we talked about the media and how important and essential a free and independent media is for operating, for basically functioning as a democratic society. If citizens do not have accurate information, it makes it very difficult for them to make prudent decisions. And so this week we're looking at two different sets of institutions, political parties and interest groups. And of course, political parties are, again, kind of essential organizing features, and we'll talk about this both in, just in a little bit, about the role that they play, both in kind of interest aggregation, but also in how government actually functions. The same thing is true for interest groups. Interest groups are typically, we oftentimes ask, what's the difference between a political party and an interest group? And the main difference is, political parties are, again, concerned with competing for and winning political offices with an aim to winning control of government. Whereas interest groups are more narrowly focused, typically on influencing some aspect of public policy. And in the process, they can exert a considerable amount of influence over, who wins elections and again, by that, who actually controls public policy. So what are we going to learn today? We're going to talk a little bit about party identification and polarization and how those two phenomena affect voters. And then we're going to start our discussion of interest groups, and we're going to talk a little bit about what interest groups do, and then we'll conclude just with some thoughts about the power of interests in American democracy. So we kind of talked about this a little bit, and again, when you're looking at political parties and the basis of how they go about appealing to Americans, Democrats appeal to organized labor, to working class and the working poor. They appeal to professionals and the college educated. They appeal to members of racial and ethnic minorities, the young and more secular Americans, civilian government workers. It's interesting when you look at that, to women and to urban voters. When you look at the civilian government workers, there is this phenomenon that we talk about a lot in sociology and in political science about the phenomenon of college towns. This idea that there are relatively small colleges, small communities. Think Chapel Hill, North Carolina, that also happens to be home to a major research university, the University of North Carolina. It is the state school. The state university, the state research university. And it's big. I mean, there's tens of thousands of people that work at the University of North Carolina, both as instructors, as administrators, various other kinds of service professionals. And the reality is that a lot of the businesses that ring that college also support that university. And it's important to keep in mind, government workers want to be able to do their job well. And so, they want to be adequately funded. And so they're generally going to support the political party that is supportive of the mission of higher education. And right now, that is Democrats. Republicans, on the other hand, appeal to non-Hispanic whites and certain Latino Americans. Think the Cuban American community, especially in South Florida, but also think the Tejano community in southern Texas. The Tejanos are distinct from other Latino Americans in that they were here, at the time of Texas secession. They have been in Texas and in the United States for a very long period of time, and they tend to be more conservatively oriented than a lot of other, Hispanic communities. They tend to, for example, to be a little bit more hawkish on the issue of immigration. Republicans are increasingly appealing to people without college educations, to women without college degrees, and also to rural voters. These are really, I mean, when you look at this particular slide, it is really, in a nutshell, the essence of the Make America Great coalition within the Republican Party. These are folks who want to stop immigration, and they want to, basically return white Americans to a position of, a greater influence than they certainly are headed towards demographically. So again, this slide also kind of shows you, who are Americans and who identifies with which party. This slide is important because, first and foremost, it provides a clear illustration that no, particular group is a monolith. It's that, a majority of women support Democratic candidates. Not all women, right? It's 60%. Likewise with men, not all men vote for Republicans, although right now the gender gap is probably as wide as it's been when you look at how women are voting and how how men are voting in this current presidential election. I think a lot of that has to do with the polarizing effect that Donald Trump has had on the American electorate. But again, when you look at the different groups, 18 to 29-year-olds are, again, right now, pretty strongly supporting Democratic candidates, but not all of them. Again, likewise with the 30 to 49-year-olds, likewise with the 50 to 64-year-olds. It's more so, again, that people over 65 are more likely, people that are in the baby boomer generation, are more likely to be, Republicans. And a lot of those folks are some of the most, MAGA voters. Likewise, again, when you look at non-Hispanic whites, it's not entirely that, that they all are voting for Republicans. It's, again, that a significant majority are. And this kind of tells you something very important about the elections that we're coming into and that we're going to talk more about next week, which is that you're not going to win all those votes, but it's important that you compete, right, for votes. If you go to rural parts of America and you ask for people's votes, as a Democrat, you may get more votes than you would otherwise. If you're a Republican candidate, you send J.D. Vance, into urban areas and you ask for their vote, you may get a greater proportion of the vote than you would otherwise. The whole job is on the Democratic side to go into rural America and to reduce Trump's margins by 2 or 3 or 4%, and likewise with Republicans, okay? So that really is sort of the essence of these campaign appeals that are, that the political parties are doing right now. It's very important that the suburbs, again, where a lot of Americans live these days, they live just outside of the large urban areas in what we call suburban America. Most Americans currently live in the suburbs. Suburban communities have been contested territory between the political parties for decades. Suburban voters favored Democrats in 2018 in the midterm elections, which brought Democrats to power in the House of Representatives, but ultimately narrowly favored Republicans in 2022. So we know that suburban college-educated moms, were once solidly Republican pre-Trump, but that Trump and what Trump represents, simply his affect, the way he speaks, the way he has. The way he has, the public policies he has ultimately supported, has cost Republicans broadly among suburban college-educated women, and that is a loss that could have significant consequences going forward. And believe me, Republicans are aware of it. Race and ethnicity, demographic changes have, again, been reflected in changing patterns of partisanship. 92% of Black Americans self-identify as Democrats, and this is something that we talk about, the politics of linked fate. It doesn't mean that all Black Americans vote for Democrats. Routinely, upwards of 12% of black males will vote for Republicans. And in part, that reflects the reality that a certain percentage of black males are cultural conservatives and have decided that they're more comfortable voting for Republican candidates than for Democrats. And that there is also the reality that Democrats have routinely had difficulty in defending the civil rights and civil liberties of minority communities. And that struggle causes some minority voters to just say, what have you done for me? And that's something that Trump has again tried to capitalize on. Say, what do you have to lose, right? The Hispanic vote is much less monolithic than the black vote. Among Hispanics, Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans tend to orient more towards Republicans owing to their experiences with their native countries. On the other hand, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Central Americans oftentimes tend to support Democratic candidates. Likewise, Asian Americans tend to split their votes, but Republicans turn to nativism, have had the effect of pushing more Asian Americans. Okay. Thank you.
That was good, man.
Okay, yeah, both those monitors are down too. So, okay, can I start again? Okay. Likewise, Asian Americans have historically tended to split their votes, but Republicans' turn to more nativist policies has pushed a lot of Asian Americans towards Democrats. Among Asian Americans in the 1990s, Asians were more likely to vote for Republicans. And again, remember, the Asian community includes, Indian Americans, Filipino Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, and some of these demographic groups are growing a lot faster than others. So again, by 2000, the Asian vote collectively had shifted toward the Democratic Party. Again, prior to 2000, many Asian Americans, kind of shared the anti-communist sentiments that made them more comfortable within the Republican Party. But culturally, most Asian Americans have more progressive attitudes on taxation and social welfare programs. So among Asian Americans today, Vietnamese Americans are most likely to have favorable views of Republicans. And oftentimes when you see Asian Americans that are running as Republicans for public office, you're seeing them oftentimes be Vietnamese and have names like Nguyen, which is kind of the Vietnamese equivalency of Smith, for surnames. Racial and ethnic composition of the two, coalitions. I think that the thing that leaps out on this slide is that the Democratic Party is much more diverse than the Republican Party. It is, the Democratic Party is, again, roughly a third white non-college educated. Well over a quarter are white college educated. A fifth are black. 12% are Latino, and then, again, whatever percentage the Asian American population is. The Republican Party, in contrast, is increasingly becoming the party of white, non-college educated voters. Close to 60% of the Republican coalition in 2020 were white, non-college educated people. Again, a minimal percentage of the Republican coalition was black. 8% were Latino, and again, that reflects the strength of Republicans in those Cuban and Tejano communities in Florida and Texas, which is one of the reasons why Florida and Texas has continued to be Republican, bastions where Republicans, consistently win statewide elections, despite the fact that, especially in the case of Texas, it is now a majority-minority state, which means there are more, Hispanic and black and Asian voters than there are white voters. Region is also, again, an important factor. States, again, along the coasts, the West Coast, the East Coast, and around the Great Lakes, are more inclined to support Democrats. Again, why? Because that's where the really large urban areas in the United States are. And it's a simple fact that large regions tend to support more government. They tend to think that large populations require greater levels of governance than they can find with Republicans in charge. The states of the Midwest and the Southeast have tended to support Republicans. 2/3 of the states are effectively one-party states. And again, this reflects this idea that voters culturally tend to support the party that reflects their cultural values. And again, in the South, there tend to be these ideas about hostility to the federal government that find a very congenial home within the Republican Party. Some states are increasingly trending purple, meaning, again, that they're becoming more and more competitive. When you think about, Florida is increasingly a purple state. Texas is trending, not as fast as Democrats would like, but it is trending in the direction of becoming more purple. Some states like North Carolina are increasingly becoming more heavily contested. And again, what does it mean to say that a state is purple? It typically means that the legislature is more closely divided, and that one party cannot consistently win statewide elections. Okay, so here in Oklahoma, for example, we are almost the opposite of a purple state. We are a deep red state. The Democratic Party is moribund at the local levels. It does not have the party does not have routine access to money. They have very little organizing capacity. They have very little in the way of bases of electoral support, and that makes it really hard, for Democrats to compete here in Oklahoma. Will that always be the case? Things may change. It may be that you will see certain groups of Oklahomans trend in a more Democratic direction in the next 10 years or so. I don't see anything changing within a 10-year time frame. But sometimes things, transition a lot more rapidly than you would imagine in politics. Age is an important consideration when you're looking at who tends to support the different parties. Boomers have tended, again, it's not an 80-20 type thing. It's more like a 55-45 type thing. The baby boomer generation that were born between 1946 and 1965 have tended to support Republicans. Millennial voters, in contrast, have generally tended to support Democrats. COVID-19 and Trump's handling of that pandemic ultimately cost him with older voters in two ways. One, a lot of people died that didn't need to die because they listened to Donald Trump and a lot of, especially the anti-vaccine and anti-social distancing kind of guidelines that were sent out by the CDC. Older Americans who had weakened immune systems were highly vulnerable to COVID-19 and died as a result. But it also cost him with some people, again, who, somebody who might have lost a loved one because they were, vaccine skeptics, or simply because they're attentive and believe that Donald Trump mishandled the pandemic. He has been, shown making public statements to the effect that he always wanted to play down the threat posed by the pandemic. And a lot of Republicans listened to him, and a lot of Republican-leaning media reflected that decision, and it cost people. People died as a result. Gen Zers, again, are moving almost as much as boomers have tended to vote Republicans. People from the Gen Z generation are increasingly supporting Democrats, in part simply because they're more tolerant. They've been raised in more diverse communities. They don't have, the concerns that a lot of baby boomers and older Americans have about how changing demographics are affecting Americans. They look at it and they say this is okay. They're not instinctively hostile to minority culture like rap music and things like that. And so again, that just again reflects an important sense in which culture is evolving. And some people are simply not. They're not going to change because they have reached a point in their lives where they're simply not interested in those kinds of changes. Affective polarization is an important concept. It again reflects a form of partisanship that inspires a visceral, emotional dislike of the other party. And so very often, surveys show that Americans' feelings toward their own party are stable and often ambivalent, but the negative feelings towards the other party have dramatically spiked. And that again contributes to this idea of negative partisanship, where voters are oftentimes basically holding their nose and supporting a political party because they are voting against the other party rather than because they are actually in support of the things that their party believes in. Minor parties are, occasionally an element that can play a role in elections, and we'll find out more about that in our next week's presentations. So despite the fact that the two political parties dominate the electoral process, minor parties will often crop up and they will oftentimes persist. In the late 19th and early 20th century, you saw the emergence of groups of people that called themselves populists and called themselves progressives. And they oftentimes, one of the great reasons why the two-party system persists is that historically the two parties have been very adaptable and have been very good at absorbing the issues and the concerns that drive the formation of third parties. And so, in fact, during the progressive era, both political parties had progressive wings of their party. Ultimately, what happened was, in fact, Teddy Roosevelt, one of America's great presidents, was a progressive Republican who oftentimes bucked his own party and formed coalitions with progressive Republicans and Democrats to govern. Ultimately, though, the progressive wing of the Republican Party kind of faded out and went kind of state and local, and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party changed the Democratic Party in significant ways. And again, some progressive Republicans migrated over to the Democratic Party over the course of the early decades of the 20th century, and ultimately helped build the New Deal coalition of the early 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the most successful third-party presidential candidates. And again, this was a guy who had been a vice president, who had served as president, who'd served 6 years as president, and then left. He voluntarily stepped down, kind of handpicked William Howard Taft to be his successor. And he went on safari in Africa, and when he came back, he felt like Taft was mismanaging the government, and so he challenged him within the Republican Party, failed to win the Republican nomination, and instead decided to form a third party, which became known as the Bull Moose Party in 1912. It didn't succeed in winning the presidency, but he ultimately finished second in the 1912 presidential race. And what it actually served to do was to act as a spoiler leading to the election of Democrat Woodrow Wilson. So that's an important thing to keep in mind about third parties, is that they can oftentimes act as spoilers. Ross Perot in 1992, again, he was a Texas billionaire. who decided he was going to run for president. He spent tens of millions of his own dollars in forming the Reform Party. His one issue was the national debt and deficit spending, and that had a powerful effect on the presidential race of 1992, because I think a lot of political scientists and pollsters believed that Ross Perot, and he got almost a fifth of the popular vote. He didn't win a state, but he siphoned enough votes away from the incumbent president, George Herbert Walker Bush, that he basically, again, enabled Bill Clinton to become president of the United States. Clinton was able to win enough votes overall and to win enough states to win the majority in the Electoral College. Right now, you're actually looking at another, presidential race in 2024, where you have third-party candidates that are clearly attempting to play the role of stalking horse for Donald Trump. Jill Stein played that role effectively in 2016. She siphoned just enough votes away from Hillary Clinton in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania to enable Donald Trump to win those states. And the question is, it's significant right now that the Harris campaign is running national ads against Jill Stein and basically naming her as a stalking horse and basically saying she has no chance of winning. Just listen to Donald Trump. And there's a quote of, an audio of Trump saying, "I love Jill Stein because she only draws from the Democratic candidate." Finally, you've got the idea of electoral reform, and this is something that is it's a significant movement. A lot of people are advocating the move to what is known as ranked choice voting, and that would be a situation where voters get the opportunity to list their candidates in different offices by order of preference. And so, the first place votes gets a certain amount of value. Second and third place votes gets a declining amount of value. And what you do is whoever doesn't get a majority, the lowest candidate gets eliminated. And then you go to the people who listed that candidate as second. The idea behind ranked choice voting, and I'll try to explain this more in our next presentation, is that it is supposed to kind of make it harder for very extreme candidates to be able to win elections. And there have been some states that have tried it. Alaska has tried it, and it has tended to have that effect. Okay? So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Now we're going to move on to the idea of interest groups. And again, the difference between an interest group and a political party is that political parties are much more comprehensively. Parties are majoritarian in nature, which is to say, especially within our system of government, they view their mission as winning control of government. Okay? Whereas interest groups are more interested in narrow issues. Oftentimes there are single issue groups out there. There are some that are more interested in broad sectors of the economy. But the main thing they want to do is nudge public policy in a direction that is advantageous to their particular group. So interest groups are effectively defined as alliances based on self-interest. Okay, so again, if you look at a textbook definition of an interest group, it'll say something like organized groups of people or institutions that employ various forms of advocacy to influence public policy. And so interest groups represent a variety of different interests. Examples of interest groups include business groups, labor unions, university associations, professional associations like the American Medical Association or the American Bar Association. There are also government associations like the National League of Cities or the National Governors Association. The point behind those kinds of institutions, those kinds of interest groups, is that they want to act collectively There's actually a group called the American City Managers Association. And their job, they held periodic conferences where city managers meet. They discuss best practices, and the job of that interest group is to make the job of city manager more manageable and more easily more advantageous again for city managers. Interest groups oftentimes have negative connotations. They're often described as special interests or pressure groups. Politicians oftentimes say, I am not beholden to special interests. A Republican candidate will say, my opponent is beholden to the teachers' unions. I am independent and I will do what's best for the people of my community. So like the media and political parties, interest groups are vital intermediary institutions. They help educate citizens on issues they care about, and they help mobilize Americans to vote in elections. Now, when you talk about that educative effect, it is motivated, right? They want to teach people about a particular aspect of the issue that they're teaching. They are advocating for policy. They are not, like the media should be, just giving people information and putting them in a position to make a decision. Additionally, some interest groups will monitor government and help the media perform that important watchdog function. So what are some different types of interest groups? There are corporate groups and trade associations, okay? Corporate groups, again, these are folks that, for example, represent the credit card industry. They want the government to advance policies that are advantageous to those companies that are in the business of extending credit to consumers. Okay? They want to make it harder, for example, for Americans to be able to declare bankruptcy or to default on their loans. That's just sort of what they want to do. Labor unions, they typically represent sectors of the economy. For example, you've seen in recent years sort of the resurgence of the United Auto Workers, where they've been under the leadership of a guy named Shawn Fain, and he has galvanized the United Auto Workers and expanded membership. And he has been able to leverage that greater energy for better collective bargaining deals with the major automakers. Again, the American automakers, oftentimes they'll negotiate the collective bargaining agreements, and then the foreign companies in other, in like southern states where most of the labor isn't unionized, will then follow suit. They'll say, okay, they're getting paid that much up there. We're going to, we're going to calculate the cost of living down here, and then we're going to make a similar kind of deal. So again, even where the United Auto Workers has not been able to unionize auto plant like Volkswagen plants in Tennessee and places like that, they have been able to influence how labor is treated in those areas. Again, you also have what we call professional associations. Again, I mentioned the American Bar Association. A major part of the Bar Association's job is, again, to protect the interests of lawyers. Now, again, there are different kinds of lawyers. There are trial lawyers, there are corporate lawyers, there are constitutional lawyers. Trial lawyers have tended to be a very influential group within the American Bar Association, and for that reason, Republicans are oftentimes very suspicious of what the American Bar Association says publicly. There are also what we call citizen groups, and these are public interest groups whose job is to advocate for consumers. Ralph Nader's various organizations. Nader's Raiders, they were a group of people that, made their bones, established a reputation in agitating for, car safety, for automobile safety. Nader in the 1960s published a big book called Unsafe at Any Speed. It was a public report on, I believe it was the Ford Pinto or something like that, which had a defective gas tank in it that when it was subjected to a rear collision, it would oftentimes burst into flames. Which is not good for a car. You don't want, you don't want a car that routinely does that. There's something that's going to happen quite frequently. So why do interest groups form? First and foremost, one of the predominant explanations for the formation of interest group is called pluralism. And that is the theory that all interests should be free to compete for influence within government, or with, should be compete for influence over government, which tends to encourage competition, compromise, and moderation. Okay, so people join interest groups in pursuit of collective goods. These are otherwise known as benefits sought by groups that are broadly available and cannot be denied to non-members. The ultimate public good, for example, is clean air, clean water, things like that, right? So that naturally creates what is known as a collective action problem, where a group that is trying to galvanize, a broad community to support something, people decide, you know what, I wish you luck, but I'm not going to contribute to your success. Because, rationally speaking, the best outcome for me is to not contribute to your success, but for you to nevertheless succeed and to have me benefit from the fruits of your success. That, in essence, is what is known as the free rider problem, right? And this is, again, effectively a collective action problem. Government can be seen oftentimes as a kind of collective action problem. So interest groups overcome the free rider problem by providing a range of what are known as selective benefits. And those benefits come in a variety of forms. One would be information benefits in the form of newsletters, periodicals, training programs, conferences, and other venues where information can be provided to members that help them do their, what it is that they want to do better. There are also material benefits that involve special goods, services, or even money that's provided to members or groups to entice others to join. There are also what are known as solidary benefits that involve, again, the fact that if you do join, you experience a sense of community, a sense of belonging, a sense of common purpose, which many people find intensely valuable. It increases their sense of their personal efficacy. And then finally, there are purposive benefits, which involve, again, selective benefits of group membership that emphasize the purpose and, again, the accomplishments of the group. So again, this is sort of, this slide kind of demonstrates the selective benefits. What's the value of a conference? Well, first of all, you're getting to network with other people. Like my wife next week is going to a county assessors conference. It's a statewide thing. All the county assessors from the 77 counties will send people to this to Oklahoma City. And again, the point of it is to have panels where you actually learn about what you need to do to be a better county assessor. Okay. There are side benefits that, again, you're also in a position where you can network, right? If you work in a county assessor's office and the county assessor is an elected position and that county assessor loses and the incoming county assessor, fires everybody on the staff and hires new people, well, you're out of a job. But if you've networked, you may be able to find a job in a neighboring county because you will have met those folks. You'll know them. You'll have someone you can call and say, hey, do you have an opening in your office? Again, material benefits, travel packages, insurance, discounts on consumer goods. These are all things that can help people kind of overcome that impulse to free ride. Solidary benefits, again, you network. You find people that are working within the same interest group. You become friends, sometimes lifelong friends. You become such good friends, you're best man at their weddings, or you're godparents to their children, things like that. Those are powerful sources of attachment. And then again, purposive benefits, you're able to get a voice within government. You're able to put yourself out there in a position that again, achieves something. So this slide kind of shows you what, the things that you go through in terms of trying to form an action group. And the first thing is you've got to figure out, do I care about something enough to want to go out and get educated about it and to learn more about it and to see if there is an interest group that's already in action. Then you want to decide on the scope of the goal. Again, if you're trying to be a multi-purpose interest group, a lot of times that means your effort is being diffused, which reduces the likelihood that you can succeed. Interest groups oftentimes try to narrow their focus down to even one issue. Think about the people you need around you. I've routinely advise student groups, student political groups, and one of the first things I tell them is there's power in numbers. You guys you care enough to try and form this this college group, but you have to be able to identify freshmen and sophomores in that group. So you have to go into the political, into the government classes, and you need to see if there are kids that are likewise interested. See if a professor will give you some time, 5 minutes to say, here's our group, here's what we're doing. We really want you to come. Because, if you're a senior and you form a group, it's not going to survive you graduating. Right? You have to have freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, and you have to continually recruit every semester within those classes to try and get enough people involved and to keep that group going. It's, to me, the student, college groups on a university campus really reflect both, the intensive, the intense life cycle of an interest group. Because oftentimes interest groups will they'll rise because of a policy entrepreneur, someone who has the energy and the time to commit to that group. But then, they're going to age out. They're either going to retire, they're going to pass away. And what happens to that group? At the college level, that's the life cycle every 4 years, right? So you have to really be engaged. Then you have to, again, keep going even when you face defeats. For example, here in Oklahoma, college Democrats, they get fired up for every election cycle, and they think we can do something. And then they campaign and they walk streets and they knock on doors, and their candidate gets crushed, and it crushes them. And you have to be resilient in order for an interest group to endure. And that is a tough thing to teach to young people, is that idea of persistence. And then finally, you have to realize that change typically comes in small steps. You have to be prepared to accept a half a loaf. You're not going to get the whole of what you want right away. You have to be prepared, to really, focus and work and take baby steps. And be prepared to say, what is the compromise that we can accept? How do we get to that point? What are compromises on the way to even that acceptable step that we may find that we have to accept? What interests are not represented? And this is, again, a quote from E.E. Schattschneider, who was one of the famous kind of pressure group political party guys of the mid-20th century. The flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper-class accent. And the reality is that without money, interest groups have real difficulty in succeeding. Sometimes there are other aspects of the group that can kind of overcome that. Very often it would be numbers, right? If you can get large numbers of people, the numbers themselves can be a force. But that is hard to sustain over time. You have to have access to money. Money gets you the organizing ability that you really need. So interest group politics is heavily skewed towards corporate business and upper class interest groups. people with resources, people with money, have a disproportionate capacity to organize. That's one of the reasons why student groups typically struggle. That's one of the reasons why you don't see an interest group that really is comprised of poor people. There are nonprofit groups that do tend to the needs of poor people, but poor people themselves are oftentimes too busy being poor to get organized. Okay? So as a result, interest group politics skews public policy in the direction of upper class and business concerns. Okay? And that has a significant consequence for American politics, because again, quite frequently, it is very narrowly construed at the national level, and of course at the state level, it's even more exaggerated. It's part of the reason why some people want to move the focus of government from the federal level to the state level, because when you go from the federal to the state to the local, money takes on an even greater influence, and the people with money have a greater capacity to control the politics at the state level, and even more so at the local level. So what is it that interest groups do? Again, the idea that you're trying to influence government means that you have to adopt an approach. You have to adopt a tactic that will enable you to successfully influence the government. So one of the first questions that you're going to ask is, are you going to adopt an inside strategy or an outside strategy? Insiders benefit again from gaining access to key decision makers by hiring lobbyists, conducting executive branch oversight, and litigating through the courts. All of these things cost large amounts of money. Outsiders generally are more inclined to engage in protest, to employ grassroots electoral strategies, and to attempt to attract media attention, again, via protests or investigations or things like that. These are things that are less money and labor intensive, and that again reflect the idea that if you are an outsider, you probably lack the resources to kind of force your way through the door. So while these strategies don't exhaust all the tactics that interest groups employ, they offer a broad overview of the approaches that interest groups will employ. So lobbying is one of the main things that interest groups do. This is, again, a strategy by which organized interest groups seek to influence the passage of legislation by exerting, or policy for that matter, by exerting direct pressure on government officials. Lobbying is protected under the First Amendment. Again, that's an interesting thing, and again, lobbying it raises the possibility of abuse. One of the famous cases was, one of the most prominent early lobbyists was a guy by the name of Ivy Lee, and he undertook. He was kind of a lawyer type, but he undertook the idea. He kind of created the whole idea of public relations relatively in the early 20th century. He ultimately took on Nazi Germany as a client and was lobbying American businesses on behalf, and the federal government on behalf of the Nazi government of Adolf Hitler. And actually was called before Congress to explain himself. And he was like, well, freedom of expression, which again highlighted a serious challenge, which ultimately resulted in the Regulation of Lobbying Act of 1946, which defines acceptable lobbying activity and compels lobbyists to disclose who they represent. Okay, so again, now there is a part. There is something you have to register with Congress as a lobbyist, and you have to disclose, in particular, if you are lobbying on behalf of a federal government. This is something that has tripped up people, over the last 10 years or so. Can anyone become a lobbyist? Could I become a lobbyist? I know a lot about government. I'm a pretty persuasive guy. Could I become a lobbyist? The likelihood is not. I could certainly hang out a shingle, Ken Hicks lobbying. But the likelihood is you become a lobbyist because you can gain access. Information is important and valuable. You also have to be able to get into people's offices. You have to be able to identify members of the state legislature or the governor's office or the federal government where you can exert some influence, get your foot in the door, where you have, again, friends that will listen to you when you lobby on behalf of a particular issue. That's one of the reasons why one of the main occupations of former members of Congress is lobbyist. Okay? You can make huge amounts of money, particularly if you develop a reputation as being effective at what you're doing. So part of the challenge here is that Congress is increasingly dependent on lobbyists. And again, to some extent, the reason for that is that the combined research staff of the Congressional Research Office, the Congressional Accountability Office, and the Congressional Budget Office saw their budgets reduced by 45% between 1975 and 2015. And much of that happened between 1994 and 2006, which is when Republicans had control of the House of Representatives and part of that time of the Senate. And again, the reason for that is Republicans want to do less governing. And you've seen this reflected also when Republicans took control of the state legislature in Oklahoma in 2006. One of the first things that they did was to begin cutting the research staff because they didn't feel like they needed it. Lobbyists, interest group also aggressively lobby the executive branch. They attempt to influence Congress in passing legislation, but that's only half the battle. Interest groups work at all levels of the executive branch, from the White House all the way down to executive branch agencies, to ensure that the laws that they've influenced are being implemented in a way that is, again, congenial to their interests. Lobbyists often participate in the rule-making process. And that's an important, again, we're going to have a discussion about that when we get to our presentations on the bureaucracy. But the idea of rulemaking is that Congress oftentimes will pass legislation that will set broad guidelines of what they want done, but then they will cede considerable discretion to bureaucratic agencies in terms of how to actually effectuate those policies. That is known as rulemaking. And again, that reflects this idea that Congress are a bunch of generalists. They don't often know how to implement complex, like agricultural subsidy policies that the Department of Agriculture will manage, or other kind of complex issues like, setting pollution rates for, that the Environmental Protection Agency will set for major, manufacturing and things like that. So it's important to keep in mind that, that this is a full court, press. And they'll have lobbyists that are specialized at all levels of government. And they really, the political parties play a role in this. K Street has a lot of, liberal lobbying shops. They also have a lot of conservative lobbying shops. This again reflects the extent to which hyperpartisanship has polarized people's basic, perceptions of government. Interest groups make policy. They will often exert influence behind closed doors. So in areas where policy making is highly specialized, like agricultural subsidies that I mentioned, military procurement, environmental policy, etc. Again, those are areas that you're oftentimes what happens with the rulemaking process occurs out of public view. and members of Congress, the executive branch agencies, and the relevant interest groups will make decisions about billions of dollars of taxpayer money that oftentimes will have little consideration of the public interest, and much more will be focused on who's getting, what in terms of money. So that gives rise to two phenomena, one called iron triangles, the other one is called issue networks. And again, iron triangles are stable cooperative relationships that develop among congressional committees, executive branch agencies, and interest groups. They form in issue areas that, again, where the issues are oftentimes highly technical and are very you almost have to have an expertise in order to follow them. So specialized knowledge will oftentimes have an exclusive effect, and the effect of excluding people from the deliberative process. Issue networks, in contrast, are much looser. There are more people involved, elected officials, public officials, appointed activists, and interest groups will again coalesce around a specific issue. So interest groups are oftentimes, or issue networks are oftentimes more fluid. They form when an issue appears where people are going to act. Education is frequently cited as an example of an issue network because everyone thinks they know how to fix the challenges associated with education. We see here in Oklahoma that you're frequently having Republicans talk about making education more competitive. Well, I don't know how you do that because you're not supposed to have multiple school districts in one area competing against one another in anything other than sports. The point of education is to educate people, and I don't know how competition improves that. But one thing they're oftentimes talking about is making public taxpayer dollars available to people, to individual families, so that they can send their children to charter schools or to even private schools. This was one of the things where the Stitt administration basically created a Catholic charter school that would be able to accept public tax dollars. That was struck down because it is a violation of both the Oklahoma and the federal Constitution. It's a violation of the Establishment Clause. Nevertheless, this remains a highly contentious issue. This slide gives you an example of how iron triangles really work. In Congress, you've got a number of different committees, right? The House and Senate Armed Services Committee, the Appropriations Committee, the Defense Appropriations Subcommittees, the Joint Economic Committee, the House and Senate members from districts with interests in the defense industry. We have an aerospace presence here in Oklahoma. A lot of that is located in the 1st District, in the Tulsa area. And that has an impact on how Kevin Hern represents that district. Congress provides support for programs that contractors favor. The defense contractors themselves, Boeing is a good example, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, General Dynamics. What do they have? They have the toys that the executive agencies need. What are the executive agencies relevant here for the defense sector? The Department of Defense, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and the Department of Energy, among others. They all have things that they need, right? The defense industry, the Department of Defense is constantly evolving in terms of how warfare is being conducted. Just think about the effect of drones on the battlefield today. If you're not aware that the United States is rapidly building a large fleet of drones that have very different military capabilities, that they're doing that, and they're spending a lot of money on that because weaponizing drones to perform battlefield functions is not cheap. So the defense contractors lobby the Department of Defense. They lobby them to try and get the defense larger budgets. They also provide people within the Defense Department, especially people in military procurement, with cushy jobs when they retire. The Defense Department itself is able to say, look, here are our needs for the battlefields of the future to Congress. That informs what Congress is looking to do in the budgetary process. Again, these things, I just mentioned drones. What about AI, artificial intelligence? That is an incredibly complex thing. Israel is using artificial intelligence right now in the conduct of their military operations against Gaza, against the West Bank, against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. They are using artificial intelligence, and we are increasingly involved in that as well. Interest groups oftentimes will also use the courts. Interest groups resort to litigation, oftentimes when they don't get their way on policies. There are basically three ways to influence the court. They will attempt, first of all, to file lawsuits. They will finance lawsuits by other groups. And then finally, they will file what are known as amicus curiae briefs. Amicus curiae is Latin for friend of the court. The NAACP is a good example from our discussion of civil rights, where, again, they did all that stuff. They sponsored families to file lawsuits. They filed amicus curiae briefs in support of certain outcomes. Over time, partisan interest groups have increasingly resorted to using the federal courts in order to get their way. And one of the things that's increasingly happening is something known as venue shopping. This is a situation where interest groups, for example, the anti-abortion movement, they know there is one district in southern Texas that only has one federal district judge. A guy named Matthew Kacsmaryk, I think it's Matthew, who is effectively, he was a pro-life lawyer. He worked on behalf of a pro-life Texas group prior to being elevated to the bench. He is sympathetic to, what it is that, that the pro-life movement, the anti-abortion movement is pursuing. And so they file suit in that particular district because they want that judge to start the case. Because again, once you start a case and once a federal judge, a federal district judge has issued a ruling, it's going to be appealed, but it gets appealed through the 5th District of the 5th Circuit, which is a very conservative circuit. And ultimately, it's going to go up to a Supreme Court that has 6 very conservative members on it that have overturned precedents on abortion before. How influential are interest groups? And it varies considerably, right? There are a number of factors that will influence whether an interest group is effective or not. You have to have strong and charismatic leadership. I mentioned this idea of policy entrepreneurs. When you think about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership of that movement, he had a powerful effect, first and foremost, because he was charismatic and because he was widely recognized as effective. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for his leadership of the Birmingham bus boycott. That comes with a substantial financial prize, which he folded into the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's coffers. But he also, when you're a Nobel Peace Prize winning activist, you get to travel the country raising money. And again, what is important? Money is a powerful organizing tool. With money, you have capacity to organize. Without money, you are going to struggle to organize. Okay? Resources, again, are powerful elements of effective, leadership, of interest group effectiveness. Large membership again, is something that politicians recognize. When a lobbyist for the AARP, which is the American Association of Retired People, walk into their office, they pay attention. If a lobbyist for the AARP calls them, they're going to take that call because the AARP is the single largest interest group in America, and because retired people oftentimes have money, are highly attentive, and are vengeful when politicians ignore them. Having a lot of staff, having a large and powerful staff is a really important element of effectiveness for an interest group. And again, that means you have to have enough money to pay people. Because effective and competent staff, there's that old saying, fast, cheap, or good, and you typically can only get two. Well, you don't get good staff when you're cheap, okay? If you don't pay people, you don't retain staff. People that want to make a career working for an interest group want to get paid. And so if you lack the resources to pay, you have to rely on volunteers. And if you're relying on volunteers, you get what you pay for. Volunteers are oftentimes doing it out of the goodness of their heart. You got to train them, and you've got to have the time and the expertise to train your staff to do well. And volunteer staffs are notoriously less competent than paid staffs. So when you look to measure interest group, influence, a lot of people feel, when you look at public opinion surveys, a lot of Americans are convinced that special interests exert too much influence. And again, there's a partisan aspect to that. If you ask a Democrat, it will be the Republican interests that are excessively powerful. They don't like the influence that the National Rifle Association exerts or the Business Roundtable. If you are a Republican, they're going to say it's those dirty unions that exert too much influence. That's really a reflection of American democracy kind of working effectively. Right? We don't like it when the other side is effective, okay? Some scholars argue that interest group activity does little to alter actual policy outcomes. Again, in a pluralist political environment characterized by organized combat, the better organized groups enjoy greater success. It's one of the things, for example, one of the imbalances in American interest group politics is that there have been no laws passed that have eroded the organizing effectiveness of major business interest groups like the Business Roundtable, the American Enterprise Institute, and things, groups like that. In contrast, Congress in the 1950s passed, or actually it was the late 1940s, passed a bill called the Taft-Hartley Act that significantly eroded the ability of interest groups to organize and to maintain themselves, over the course of of their working lives. It dramatically reduced the amount of the private sector, the proportion of the private sector that were in unions. In 1952, almost half of all Americans that were working were members of unions. Today, that's less than 10%. And there's a reason for that, and it is that, again, the laws have facilitated conservatives eroding the power of working, labor, the people that organize, the people that shower after work rather than before work. Regulating lobbying, lobbyists oftentimes will push the legal, the ethical boundaries. I mentioned the Ivy Lee situation. Jack Abramoff in 2005 was convicted on fraud and violations of federal lobbying laws. Media disclosures of the access and influence of lobbyists has led Congress to periodically limit their roles by adopting more strict guidelines, which lobbyists, again, subsequently lobby Congress to loosen. But American, political actors periodically will swear off lobbyists. But inevitably, lobbyists find their way back into government. And again, oftentimes, people working on executive staffs of presidents are lobbyists. Donald Trump campaigned for the presidency in 2016, claiming that he was going to drain the swamp. He was going to get rid of the pernicious influence of lobbyists. Today, he is surrounded by lobbyists. Okay? And again, that sort of reflects the nature of especially of interest group politics. Many of our interest groups are what we call institutionalized. They have become durable institutions that are capable of resisting the vicissitudes of the electoral process. They have access to enormous sums of money, and they are, again, on that basis, really, really durable. Okay? Political parties and interest groups. What do you think? Government, basically reflects the idea of political institutions converting the public will into action. And the reality is that few public programs and policies emerge from the political process without having been affected somehow by the intermediary institutions sitting between citizens and government. James Madison in Federalist 10 famously said, "Liberty is to faction as air is to fire." And what did he mean by that, by that statement? He meant that interest group, if you give people freedom, they will form associations. And those associations will attempt to work government to influence government to favor them. Okay? So it is an inevitable feature of liberty. And the question is, how do you control that? And Madison's answer was by creating separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and constraints on majority rule that prevent any one faction from seizing control of government. Okay? So some questions for us to consider. Is partisan polarization likely to remain high in the near future? Is it going to continue to affect our political parties, to infect our political parties and our interest groups? Is this a serious problem? What can be done to reduce polarization if you think that polarization is a problem? What can you do to reduce the polarization of parties, the electorate, and intermediary institutions like interest groups and the media? What can be done? It's an interesting question. It's even as somebody, like myself that studied politics for, a considerable portion of my adult life, there are lots of proposals, but, it's hard to say that any one of them can absolutely have an impact. Okay? So, that's it for political parties and interest groups. When we come back, we're going to move on to an equally important aspect of American government, and that is the electoral process. And the electoral process includes, again, specific elections, how people participate, and the campaigns that candidates for office will employ in order to advance their electoral interests and improve their likelihood of success. These are processes that naturally draw on the media, naturally draw on political parties and interest groups, and really kind of bring all these things that we've been talking about over the last 2 or 3 weeks into focus. I'll see you next time.